Hello chess family, it's me National Master, Jesse James, and today we're taking a look at rule number 26. Do not place pawns of the same color as your bishop, which makes a lot of sense. Whatever color the bishop's on, it's going to be naturally attacking it. So when you do that, they'll get attacked. Let's take a look how Morphy instructionally takes out his opponent, Napoleon. This is a very cool game. As you can see, Morphy was so ahead of his game, he's going ahead and taking off a pawn here. Not recommended for those amateurs, but for those skilled players, you're more than welcome to try some games where you're giving away free material, or an odds game, as they do call it. All right, here we go. Napoleon starts off with e4, and very interesting here enough, Morphy goes ahead and plays pawn to e6, the French. Ew. All right, here we go. d4, d5, pawn takes. Typically does not give you an advantage when you play the exchange variation. With that being said, I like to play the Monte Carlo every once in a while, which is whenever you play pawn to c4 here to create the isolated pawn. Now you could do this. This is just not needed as you're already up a pawn here. So play simple chess. Let's just develop our pieces. Let's get our pieces out. Here Napoleon does very well. Bishop d3, knight f6, knight f3, bishop d6, and castles. Now you do have to be a little careful here. Notice there was some strategy of where Morphy took off his pawn. The pawn on the f file was taken out so that whenever this was played, whenever they castle, the rook now has the open file here. So you do have to be careful for attacks here. But if you can go ahead and navigate these storms, you should just be winning. All right, well, Napoleon's turn. He wants to kick it up a notch. Pawn c4 gets played. He willingly goes into an isolated pawn. Unfortunately for him, Morphy does not like giving him this and goes ahead and just plays simple. Pawn to c6 here. Pawn c5. Not really a move I really like. A lot of times with this c5 move, you're going to be getting undermined after moves like pawn to b6. Well, bishop c7 gets played. And now a very interesting move here by Napoleon, knight to e5. Now this is the double-edged move, meaning it could be good or it could be bad. Here, this does give Morphy some good attacking chances. He goes ahead and takes on e5. Pawn takes on e5, and now it's your turn. What should we play here as black? Notice here we do have some undefended pawns. The knight is pretty much getting ready to move. Where's the best place for this knight? Of course, knight to g4 gets played as it's attacking the pawn on e5. And also you can see there's a lot of pieces over here aimed over at this king. All right, here we go. Pawn h3 was played. A very interesting move here. Of course, Morphy goes ahead and takes the pawn on e5. And here a nice combination to get the pawn back. Unfortunately, even after he wins his pawn back, his pieces aren't really developed. And yeah, Morphy just has a good game here. Well, first things first, let's win our pawn back. Do you see the combination here? White to move. Undefended knight. Look for those checks. Simple chess. Bishop takes on h7 check. King takes. Queen h5 check. And king back to g8. Queen takes on e5. And yes, he did win his pawn back, but now it's black to move. And Morphy's going to be doing a very good job by keep developing and bringing out his pieces. Develop with the threat here. Simple chess. Knight d7, a nice move here, attacking the queen, but also the undefended pawn on c5. This is pretty much forcing for white. Only move to hold on to the pawn and the queen. Queen to d4. Here he plays queen to g3 here, unfortunately. And well, free pawn's a free pawn. It's not even winning the pawn is as good as where the knight is heading next. Knight to e4 is actually a very annoying move. All right, Napoleon, let's see how you do now. Develop with the threat. Bishop g5 gets played. How did you know I wanted to move my queen? Queen e8 gets played. Knight to d2. This makes a lot of sense. Here, again, Morphy was trying to go knight to e4 here. A very nice fork. And, well, if you try to play knight c3 for this, well, black can play pawn d4 with the knight e4 coming up next. So, does not give him that possibility. Knight to d2 gets played, with the knight most likely getting ready to travel to this f3 square. All right, black to move. What's the next piece we want to move? Of course, it's our bishop. Where's the best place for our bishop? Here, this one was a bit tricky. Morphy just keeps it simple. Bishop to d7. Develop with the threat. Rook a to e1. Looks like Napoleon's doing okay. All right, where should we move our queen to? Always looking to make threats. And of course, if you know Morphy, he's going to head toward his opponent's king. Queen to g6 here, making a nice little pin. And here, unfortunately, a very bad move going into a losing endgame. Bishop to e7. Now, it looks like a good move because we do got a nice fork here, attacking both the rook and the knight. Well, unfortunately, like I said, Napoleon did not calculate ahead. Now, Morphy makes the necessary trades to not lose the exchange, and then, of course, just go into a good endgame. What do we play here? Simple chess. Let's do it. Queen takes on g3. Pawn takes on g3. These double pawns are made, which is going to be bad for the endgame. You'd rather have these 3 pawns versus the one than the double pawns here. So this is already bad for him with just the pawn structure. All right, now it's time to get out of this fork. Simple chess, check, takes, and now we have time to move the knight away. Knight to d3, a nice little fork here attacking both the rook and the pawn on b2. Here, well, simple chess, we got to move this rook away. Although, I do like the way Napoleon plays this. He doesn't play the standard rook b1, which is not the most precise move here. Remember, guys, try not to put your rook behind a pawn like this because, well, the rook is going to have to stay here until you move it away. So I like the way Napoleon plays here. Rook to e3. Of course, taking the pawn on b2 is now taboo. What happens after knight takes b2? Although you do win the pawn, you're going to lose it right back and also help out your opponent. What do you play here? Of course, rook to b3, forking the knight and also the pawn. Notice whenever you take this pawn on b7, the rook becomes very active. Remember, rooks are best placed on the 7th or the 2nd rank to attack naturally the pawns. And then after that, put your rook behind pawns to attack them or to defend them. Not in this case, though, as the rook would just be doing nothing. Well, in the game, of course, Morphy saw this and he tries to make progress. Look at this nice and tricky move. Right now, hopefully you can see where does black have his main advantage? Well, anytime you win a pawn, there's definitely going to be an advantage because you're going to be getting either a candidate pass pawn or a pass pawn. For those of you who don't know, a candidate pass pawn is a pawn that has no pawn in front of it but can still be stopped. For instance, this c pawn is a candidate pass pawn. Although it has no pawn in front of it, it can still be stopped by the c pawn. Here we only have one pass pawn in the position, which is the d pawn. Now this is a very important pawn because no pawn can stop it. So white will have to actively stop it by using the pieces. Of course, it's a lot easier when you just have a pawn to stop it because, well, pawns don't move around much anyways, right? Here Morphy knows that and he starts getting his center moving. Very nice move here. Pawn to c5. How beautiful is that? Why can't we take on d3? Simple chess, pin it and win it. Yes, you can try to play something like king e2 because, well, if you take, well, this is not so bad for you. But, be careful. Pin it and when it gets played. And here rook takes d2 is being threatened. Bishop takes d3 is still being threatened. This is just a lost position here for white. Oof. Morphy was not only a master of attack, but also a very good endgame player. So, after the pawn to c5 right here, pawn to b3 gets played. And this makes sense. One of the ideas is that, well, if bishop b5 gets played, you can try the knight c4 to block. This is not really winning, but it was a move that was tried. All right, Morphy keeps making progress. Rook to e8, a nice little pin right here of the bishop. Of course, the rook is being defended by the bishop, so you don't have to worry about any kind of discovery ideas. All right, white plays pawn a4. Not one of the best moves here. Remember, do not place pawns on the same color as your opponent's bishop. And here we see we have 1, 2, 3, 4 pawns that are all in the same color as this bishop. Oof, you're going to see how Morphy very nicely takes advantage of this. All right, our turn. Let's keep making progress. Pawn to d4 gets played. And of course, we don't want to play rook takes on d3. This was played. Well, it's a really hard position to play here. After rook takes d3, we can't go bishop b5 anymore, but now we get to take back on e7, and now you can see which rook is better. Of course, the e rook. This rook is just controlling the open e file, while this rook is, well, being blocked in by a pawn. I guess you could play rook to f3, but again, this is not helping you out too much. Oof, here we go. Knight f3 gets played, trying to improve the knight. And now a nice move here, pawn to a5. What does this move do? Simple chess. Remember we said we want our opponent's pawns on the same color as your bishop, or opposite, right? So, whenever this is happening, you're keeping your opponent's pawns on the light squares. All right, here we go. White tries to improve the position. King f2, maybe stopping any kind of rook e3 ideas that could happen. And now, take a second here, see if you can find the very nice move here for Morphy to make progress. I'll give you a hint. Morphy would like to start moving these pawns forward, but these pawns are in the way. What should you do here to remove these defenders? All right, hopefully you found it. A very nice strategic move, pawn to b5. We're going to force some trades here. What's better than one pass pawn? Two pass pawns. The idea here is to trade these ones so that we can have two pass pawns, and these guys will be able to defend each other while they move down the board. This is a very nice endgame technique here. Also, I do want to point out, for those of you who are trying to learn their endgame and take it up to the next level, rook and bishops work better than a knight and rook. This is one thing that is very standard at high-level play. Experts and masters will know this, so they would try to go into these endgames where it's rook and bishop versus rook and knight. The rook and bishop work together, then the rook and the knight. All right, here we go. Of course, this is pretty much forced because, well, if you don't take, I'll take. So pawn takes, bishop takes, rook move back to d2. Let's get rid of this pawn so we can get this pawn moving forward. Of course, we play. Oop, I'm sorry. A very nice technique move. a4 will be getting played, but rook e3 gets played here first. Notice the technique here. With the rook here, it's going to be cutting off the king and also putting pressure on the pawn on b3. Now here, white's best move is to go ahead and attack. Always try to be active in the endgame. So rook c2 was actually one of the better ways to play here. Unfortunately for white, again, he was not a very good endgame player. He plays rook to b2 here. So try to stay active and keep your pieces as much squares as they can control. Well, all right, here we go. Rook c3 here, noticing the bad idea and not allowing rook c2 to happen again. g4, and only now does he play pawn to a4 here. Again, we're trying to get rid of these pawns so that we can get the c and d pawn rolling. Pawn takes, bishop takes, pawn to g5, and now very good endgame technique. Remember, whenever you're ahead in material, try to make as many trades as pawns. Trade pieces, not pawns. So what do we play here? Simple chess. Rook c2 check. Rook is forced to take, bishop takes. And again, we're moving down the line of winning endgames. Why? Well, bishops are favored over knights, especially in this endgame. Why in this endgame? Well, because there's pawns on different sides of the board. These pawns are rolling forward, and this bishop can move back and forth easily. The knight would probably take 2 or 3 moves here to move back and forth, and that's definitely one of the weaknesses in the position. Also notice these pawns are not going to be as well placed because, again, if there was a pawn on the f file, we might have been able to trade this pawn for this pawn, which would have given us 2 passed pawns here. And, well, that's going to be a lot easier to play than, I'm not sure, I guess you have to, you can trade this pawn for this pawn, but again, these pawns are stacked on top of each other, so it's not going to help you out too much because they can't work together. All right, king e1 gets played. A nice way for white to play. White's going to try to move over here, put pressure on the pawns, but now a very nice final move here, bishop to e4. The easiest endgames to win are king and pawn endgames, and it is true here. Here, black is just going to go ahead and simply trade either for the knight or maybe take a pawn on g2. Again, not much you can do here. King to d2 got played, and now it's game over. Bishop takes, pawn takes, and, well, can you figure out the final idea here? What should we play here as black? Simple chess and endgames, there's a nice rule. Whenever you have connected passed pawns, the king cannot harass them or win them. Because if you ever try to win one, the other one gets pushed forward. Well, this is not the case over here because the pawn on g7 can block both of these sides. So, simple chess, all we're going to do is bring our king over here, win the pawns. This king has 2 weaknesses. The weaknesses of the passed pawns and also the king having to defend. Simple chess, we're just going to go attack the pawns. When the king comes over here to defend, we push the pawns. If the king comes over here to stop the pawns, we attack these pawns. Beautiful technique here. King f7, king d3, king g6, pawn h4. Again, you cannot try to harass these pawns. King up, and, well, Morphy would simply take, and you can't take the pawn as the other pawn just gets pushed. Oof, okay, game's over. Here, white goes ahead and plays pawn to h4, king h5, king e4, king takes on h4, f4, pawn to g6, and now it's game over. A nice final move here. As well, white just can't make progress. If you try to bring your king up to e5, passed pawns must be pushed. d3 just gets played. And, well, this pawn, by the time he tries to get over there, is just going to be too late. And, of course, if you try to play the move of f5, what do you play here? Of course, if you take, things can change up very fast after king takes f5. Well, the pawn's only 3 squares away. This is only 3 squares away. It's actually becoming a drawn position. So, good technique here. King takes on g5, blocking this pawn from going to f6 and also guarding your pawn over here on g6. Remember, you don't have to worry about this king coming over here as the passed pawn rule will work. So, in the game, after g6 got played, king to d3, king to g4, king e4, d3. Not needed, but nice technique here. King takes, just a diversionary tactic so we can win our final pawns over here. Remember, in chess, all you need is 1 pawn to win the game. Here, this king is way too far to be going over here to stop it. Here, we just need good endgame technique. Here, Morphy plays king f5, which, well, best endgame technique would actually be king f4 here, as he gets closer to the queening square and is getting ready to escort the pawn. Remember, lead with the king, not with the pawn. In the game, king f5 is certainly good enough to win, though. King to d4, and g5 gets played. Again, not the best technique here for Morphy at the end, but he did calculate this to the win. As well, if king e3, simple chess, king to g4, king to f2, king to h3, king to g1, and now we can actually just push the pawn forward or even play king g3 to get on the tempo. But here, we'll just do it with good technique here. King to g3, king h1, g4, king g1, king h3. This is actually in Dovadetsky's endgame manual, which I highly recommend that you read. If the king goes to h1, it doesn't matter. They're off tempo here. You just kind of push the pawn forward. And at this point, he's in Zugzwang. King f2, king h2, game over. Well, hope you enjoyed this game. Remember, in your endgames, do not place pawns on the same color as your opponent's bishop, or opposite, whenever you're playing the reverse side, right? All right, guys, hope you enjoyed that game. Rule number 26. I'll see you guys next time.